listener production.
Hello, I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Welcome to this episode of The Briefing. The world is about to get its first millennial saint. Carlo Acutis was 15 years old when he died in 2006 of leukemia. He was born in London before moving to Italy with his parents. He enjoyed things a lot of teenagers do: video games, basketball, action movies, football. But he was devoted to his faith. He came to be known as God's influencer by creating websites dedicated to Catholicism and its saints. Some even call him the patron saint of the internet. Now he has been cleared to actually be canonised, that is, formally recognised by the church as a saint, after the Pope attributed 2 miracles to him, both of which happened after he died. So, how does one go from ordinary teen to holy idol for Catholics around the world? And just how big of a deal is it for the church to be canonising a millennial? Joining me now to explain is Father Anthony Robbie. He's a priest of the Archdiocese of Sydney. Father Robbie, thanks so much for joining us today. I think the world's kind of been captivated by this idea of this young boy becoming a saint, but it's nothing new in the Catholic Church, but it might be to a lot of our listeners, and myself included, who have very little understanding of the Catholic Church and how it works. So tell us the process for someone to become a saint.
All right. Well, there is a little bit of misunderstanding about that. I suppose some people might think that the Church goes around trying to identify suitable candidates who are appealing or necessary for particular times in history. In fact, the process is sort of a little bit reversed. The Church's only job is to try to identify what God is already doing. And what that means in practical terms is that it investigates what we might describe as an already existing devotion among a significant number of people. When that's happening, then the Church's formal authorities are called in to give a little bit of a look at what's going on, examine the person who's aroused this devotion, and see if there are grounds by which that individual might be given wider recognition in the Church, if you like, which eventually leads to the declaration of a saint.
Yeah, okay. So I guess in practical terms, can you explain to us what work someone might be doing in their life that would potentially lead for them to be canonised following their death?
All right. Well, I suppose there'd be a distinction to make between what they might be doing and the effect that has on other people. There are lots of people who do very praiseworthy activities all the time. It might be, charitable activities, for example, that would be the sort of thing that would gain a lot of recognition in the wider community. That's not, in fact, what you look for in the first place. You look for a degree of devotional attachment among a significant number of people, so that, in other words, they think that this particular person to whom they're praying is close to God and is in a position to get answers to prayers. And so a prayer devotion builds up for a particular person. When that's happened, then the Church comes in and looks at the life of that person to see whether the life is an admirable one, whether it is the sort of life that one could propose as a model for other people to follow. And there you start to have the roots of the investigation, which leads to a canonization in the long term. So there are 2 aspects of this then that a saint presents to the wider community. One is intercession, that is, they're in heaven and they're praying for us. 2, imitation. It's a good example for other people to follow.
I spoke in the introduction about Carlo and this new saint who's going to be the world's first millennial saint. And there was a line in one of the stories I read, and it said, it quoted the Vatican's saint-making department. Now, I'm sure it has a much more official title. However, to me, it sounded quite bureaucratic to have, this department of the Vatican that's sole responsibility is, deciding whether people get to become saints or not. How does that work? What are the inner workings of that department like, and who ultimately gets to decide who is a saint or not?
It's a bureaucracy which is composed of theologians and historians, and also in the later stages of medical experts for when the investigation of the famous miracles is undertaken. But in the first place, they're quite serious scholars who look at the documentation which is sent to them from around the world. We're at the moment in preparing to submit considerable amount of documentation about a potential Australian saint. And so all of these documents arrive in Rome, and then they're looked at by committees of historians in the first place, and then theologians to see if they can identify, firstly, if the elements reported are accurate in the life of this saint, then to see if they exhibit the virtues which are necessary for the proclamation of a saint. And then after those opinions have been given by the panels of experts, then it's submitted to a committee of cardinals who look at the results of their investigations and draw their conclusions. And if they decide that they think there are grounds to proceed, then finally it goes to the Pope and he makes his own decision on the matter.
So yeah, I was right. It is a process that is steeped in bureaucracy, but obviously it's something the Catholic Church takes really seriously. I want to talk about the idea of miracles and, with Carlo, who I'm referring to because it's, this story that's gotten so much attention. He's said to have, two miracles have been attributed to him posthumously. Both involved worshippers praying to him for medical intervention in separate, issues that they had, and then being cured or making a miraculous recovery. I'm interested to hear, you said that there is a medical proponent of, this saint-making department. How do they decide that it was God and not science or medicine or just one of those freaks of nature that happen?
Perfectly sensible question. And in fact, that's a very important element at the end of the process. The examination of a miracle is sort of like asking for God's agreement to what is otherwise a simply forensic investigation that's gone on up until that point. Can you be sure that something that's claimed to be a miracle is a miracle, and even if it is a miracle, that it's attributed to that particular individual? Well, there are two stages that you go through. The first is a medical examination to see if something that's apparently miraculous has happened. Now, anything could be a miracle. I mean, we could talk about the sun rising every day as a miracle if we want, but when we come to these things, they're almost always medical healings, and there are very, very limited occurrences which will be accepted as miracles. For example, a healing that is going to be accepted as a miraculous one must be instantaneous, permanent, and not attributable to any medical treatment. Now, as you can imagine, there aren't many healings that are going to satisfy those criteria. I mean, almost none. It's almost impossible. But the whole point of it is that if God's doing it, well, God can do that, and there mustn't be any confusion about it. So you can't pass off something that's simply a medical healing, which is the result of medical treatment, as a miracle. And there are even more conditions as well. When it comes to something like cancer, for example, it's well known medically that sometimes people go into remission for reasons that aren't apparent, and medical science can't explain it. So if it's a cancer issue, they require 10 years of remission in order to be absolutely certain, because sadly cancer does come back, having sort of disappeared suddenly.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that there are such stringent rules, like a timeline. 10 years of remission is so specific. Referring back to Carlo and this 15-year-old boy who is on track to be canonized, how rare is it for someone so young to be a millennial? I think I was reading something, the Pope, who he's made over 100 beatifications, and the youngest person up until Carlo was born in 1926. So this does feel like quite a rare event for someone so young to be made a saint. Would you agree?
Well, I think there are saints who've been born since then, but this is a very unusual situation, of course, for a young person to be canonized, simply because unless they're a martyr, which Blessed Carlo is not, usually their lives haven't had the opportunity to develop in such a way as to exhibit those qualities, which we call heroic virtue. So heroic virtue is not just ordinary virtue, but virtue beyond what you would expect in a person of those conditions, whether it was a nun or a priest or a teenager in these circumstances. This is unusual, but then that's the nature of saints. They do stand out from the crowd, don't they?
Father Anthony Robbie, thank you so much for talking to us today and for explaining something that I think a lot of people would have no idea about how it worked. We do appreciate your time.
You're very kind. Thank you very much indeed. All the best.
That was Father Anthony Robbie, a priest of the Archdiocese of Sydney. And that is all from us at The Briefing today. Thanks so much for joining us. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this episode with someone you know if you think they'd enjoy it. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.